Okay, now we're recording.
Okay.
So do you want to tell me your maybe your history as a Christian, maybe your the broad
The broad stroke.
Yeah.
I was born in 1951. Back then, it was in the ghetto of the people who had escaped from Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl days. It's called Oildale. A lot of violence, a lot of different things. I was born there. No culture, really. When I was brought up, my whole family kind of talked like this. So I was brought up talking not like a redneck, but for somebody who was just up on the hills of Oklahoma. And yet, in that world, for some reason, I was drawn towards literature, art, history. Time went on, the hippie thing happened, the army thing happened.
And you were involved in the hippie movement?
I was in the army, was involved, well, I was kind of in the outskirts, but right from the beginning, it was a cultural revolution. But it seemed from the beginning that I saw that cultural revolution only could go so far. And of course, it turned out to be true. But then there was a Jesus revolution back in late 60s, which I got involved in right then, back, 69. Went to LA, worked on the street, a street program, helping people on the street, prostitutes, addicts. Gave a period of my life to that. Learned a lot of things about that. Learned about God's grace, at least at street level. Then time went on. There was a church that was started in California, in the Santa Cruz area, up in the mountains, back in like 71, 72. And it attracted a lot of people. I worked there with the pastor. I was like the assistant. Had programs on rock and roll stations. It was like really street level kind of a ministry. And yet we only could go only so far as that, because we didn't know a whole lot about the sacramental church nor about history. We were versed in a lot of this, which I would call the saints of Protestantism, which there were many godly men had read their books, and let's just say even C.S. Lewis, who came close to understanding what that meant, and he talked about the myth-poetic concept of perception, so to speak. And that's what we were seeing, which the church lacked, because I was commissioned by the pastor of this church to do one thing, to spend all my time, is, this was like in 72, to write up a, let's just say, a teaching that we could teach a church about baptism, the history of baptism. Certainly a lot of people got baptized all over, but what was the history? We didn't know. Most of us didn't know anything before the Reformation. So I started digging, and it was hard to find, and then I came across this one book on the Incarnation by St. Athanasius. That gave me an inkling of something about what a sacrament is. We started looking at sacraments. We started saying, oh my gosh, we don't even know what the hell a sacrament is. We have faith, we have a simplicity, and God's grace is working here. but it was like a lake. Water came in, water went out, and a lot of the work had to do with using our energy. Perhaps we were even involved in what I would call the cult of personality, based on personalities, based how they preach, based how this and that. But not saying all that, not saying that God's grace was not there. And at that point, we started looking at Catholicism. We started looking at the traditional Lutheran Church, and we started looking at Orthodoxy. And it was at about that very same time that we came in contact with then Father Seraphim Rose, which is another story, but he opened up some doors.
Do you want to say more about that?
No.
Okay.
It's a mysterious thing. I've met a lot of different people throughout my travels, and not one is above another in some areas. But he certainly was he made a big difference, because he was able to articulate and understand where we were at. His words to us, even back then, was, be cautious, go slow. But anyhow, long story short, through different means and times of, I found myself in Russia right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and thus becoming acquainted with what I would call the ancient spirit of Orthodoxy, what was my first impressions? Well, I flew into St. Petersburg. I still had the upbringing of people who were from the land, the Okies, but I also had educated myself. And so, but my mind wasn't really cluttered up at that point. So when I was landed in St. Petersburg for the first time in Russia, I had $600 in my pocket, no way getting back home. So I was committed, so to speak, but my first impression was chaos, desperation, hope, barbed wires, dogs, guns, outside markets, grayness. I think it was in the end of May. And I was taken to an Orthodox church right from the airport. But the airport was really, it opened my mind up, like, okay, you're in a whole different world. But it wasn't until I got to the Orthodox church, which they were just starting to have services. Everything was closed down right before that. We're talking about the beginning of the thaw. And when I got to this old ancient Orthodox church, it was like I had walked into the ancient world. They weren't nice like us. We're here in America. They were not polite. People were trying to get into church. They were crowded. There was all kinds of people, peasants, mafia people, regular people, Orthodox people. There was this one priest who was there, who had just been let out of the gulag not too far beforehand, and he was considered a saint. He was an older man. I didn't know any of this. All I know is this one guy named Dr. Smirnov picked me up at the airport and told me that we're going to go see this beautiful, as he called him, priest who had been a living martyr. And so Dr. Smirnov and a couple of the big guys, deacons, they ushered me through all this crowd of people, elbowing people. I didn't know where they were taking me. But they took me through the church. It was crowded, hot, smelling, incense. It was just like I had to be at the temple sometimes, way, way back. It wasn't Orthodoxy that had gone through here in our country. It was relatively civilized. This was something different. I had seen the revivals that had happened here in America back in the early 70s with the Jesus Revolution. This was a different kind of revival. They elbowed me through the crowd, got me up there, took me behind the iconostas. Back then, I couldn't even have told you really what that all meant. All I know is where they taken me. And they took me in the back. And there was these priests, and they were having a service. They were going through a service, but way in the corner was this old man with a riasa on. He didn't have liturgical garments on, just a simple black riasa. And they go, "That's the one we want you to see." And he was the one who had been in the gulag. And he was drinking tea in the back, you know. I go, "Wow, this is different." I sit down. There was a deacon there. And he asked me my name. I didn't know any Russian. And I said, "I'm Donald." He goes, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Well, a lot of places, but let's just say Montana." And he looked at me for a long time. And he talked for a long time with this deacon. I go, "What?" And the deacon says, "Excuse me, sir." He said, "Your name is not Donald. It has never been Donald. Never. It has always been Daniel." And I was taken out of the linear concepts of Western civilization and Protestant, from A to B, and I was lifted up into a space that was timeless. My name has always been Daniel. That was the first taste of the eternal. That moment. And I really was not some kind of holy man at that point. I was there in Russia, working the streets, helping the poor, the hungry, but at night I drank. People gave me whiskey. But that touched me right there. And then I started to understand that in Russia, the whole concept of holiness is completely different than here in America. We have been marinating with Protestantism for our whole history, but we have to remember that in Russia, there was never a Reformation. And so I'm plugged into something completely different, a holiness that does not have to be with Protestantism. I don't smoke, I don't chew, and I don't run around with the people who do kind of religious holiness. Because little by little, going to the monasteries, where the rough people are, where I saw people just coming out of the gulag, going to their rooms as they're drinking their tea and smoking their smelly Russian cigarettes. Yet these people had suffered for years in the gulag. They want what you would think of holy men. And I met a few holy men, let's just say, in my time there, but that whole idea is very rare, and there's very few spiritual fathers. Even back in Russia's history, it's been very rare to have one, a true one. I met one. But anyhow, they take me back there. He said, and I go, wow. And the next day, this famous priest, sufferer of Christ, came and picked me up. I didn't even know he was coming, and he took me to this monastery that had been under persecution, had just opened up out of Novgorod. And I didn't know, I couldn't understand what they were saying. Dr. Smear, I understood I was going someplace for a couple of days, like a monastery. So I get to this old monastery. There's the priest there, and it's a woman's monastery. But it's going through services. There's all these peasants from around the monastery who are there. They all looked like they could have been living 200 years ago. It was cold, absolutely cold in there. The only warmth was from the candles and the smell of candles burning and wax and honey and the incense and the sweet prayers. And I was sitting there, but I was tired. And I hadn't kind of beefed myself up for the Orthodox calisthenics, so to speak, standing there waiting. I was weak. Here's these kids, 12 years old, standing there, But this little girl came up and she spoke some English, and she said, Danielle, go outside. The sun is shining. Go find a grassy place, lay down. God's mercy's out there also, near the church. She saw that I was cold, and I thought, wow. So I just did that, walked out, found this grassy little hill, and I laid there. So the service kept going on, and they started doing this procession around the church. And I happened to be in the circumference of that procession. They're going around. So I go, oh my gosh, what do I do? I'm laying here. It's kind of embarrassing. They're not looking, but I was thinking through. And then all of a sudden, they all circle me, and they're starting to sing hymns, beautiful hymns. And I was going to get up, and the priest spoke in, and he goes, oh, Danielle, stay there. We are having a service because there have been 40 martyrs were killed at the place you are laying. The communists had killed them. I was starting, he goes, no. Lay down. Soak in this place. Again, this is a key to what we're going to be talking about, iconography. The whole concept of what that is and what the ancient faith really means and what that entails. And so it entailed a lot. And it started a journey, that whole journey of finding a master, becoming obedient to the master, going to Alaska, Kodiak Islands, staying isolated for 7 years, coming here, the last 10 years working here on the icons, because it is what I could do. I was never going to be a priest. I was never going to be a deacon. That wasn't, I was an Orthodox soldier. I was a layman. I went out on the streets, smuggled food into Russia, was arrested there, all this. That was my world. But in that world, I was under a master. That's how they teach. One-to-one. You do everything he does through this whole process. And it was a terrible process. He kept wanting to chase me out of Russia, saying, I can't believe I'm even trying to teach an American. There's no poetry in your hand. Your eyes don't know how to see. Your icons, they're just going to be counterfeit. You're going to look at another icon, paint that, no. This is about creativity. And you've got to learn to give that unto Christ. And I didn't understand that, but it was like a cold night in Moscow, and I was trying to figure all that out. And that old song came on the Russian radio about the drummer boy. You know that song? It's a beautiful song. It's about the birth of Christ, and these guys come in and bring him incense and gold, and there's a little peasant drummer boy. Everybody offers to Christ everything, and he has nothing. And he comes up to Christ and he says, I have nothing to give you. He goes, I can play these drums. Can I play them for you? And I heard that and I said, oh, yeah, okay. I'm seeing that. That helped me understand what we were doing there. We created a brotherhood. Work in the streets, understanding what a warrior was, understanding the dignity of what a layman is. It was raw. It was primitive. There was miracles. And but the hardest process was to trust in God's Holy Spirit and not try to create something, okay, on the radio, on the thing, you know, this and that. I'm glad all my name has been erased because it had all had to do with Russia anyhow. And I figured everything that happened to me that was on YouTube has been redacted somehow. Because even when I was there, the State Department of the United States of America were investigating me. Oh, bringing in food, bringing in medicine. Dicey times. Crossing the border. Good times too. 40% of it, I was drunk. I didn't give a damn. I wasn't trying to be some holy man. But I understood what that started meaning then. It didn't mean look like when you come to church like you just ate a pound of raw liver. That wasn't it. This was the time of the underground church, the cemetery church, the people who met outside, the kitchen culture. And for once in my life, I started understanding what sacrament meant, what the priesthood meant, what the whole liturgy is about. That prayer, all of this, was not placed in my head, but through the years I was there, it's what they call, it's a circumcision of the heart. And this is what iconography is. When I was being taught, my teacher said there's two kinds of iconographers, and both of them have their pluses and minuses. There is what we call the cold artist. He's one who's very precise, understands, bam, you know. There's a place for him. Then you have the hot iconographers, like let's just say, there's been many of them through history, but the first one is Rublev, Andrei. They're full of color, and he took in the Byzantine, how straight, you know, how the Byzantine, you know, no, he took it and it went through suffering. The floating icons that you see up here, the golden ones, where we understand that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The first icon ever made was the first verse in Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, the spiritual and the material. This is the beginning. There was no Protestants then. There were no holy men then. There was no. He created heaven and the earth, the spiritual and the material, and he breathed on the material. And the form of the earth was void, without form, and the Spirit of God hovered over it. First thing he said is, "Let there be light." Bam. So iconography is in celebration of that creativity. The material that God puts light into, a window, a place, an understanding of ancientness. And it's the smell of battle, the smell of sweat, the smell of suffering, the smell of righteousness. It's a lot of different things. But if an iconographer could explain it, then why would he need to paint it? That's somebody who's trying to do a theological sermon with an icon. That's not what an iconographer does. He realizes that if he's doing an icon of St. Seraphim, that this guy, he's eternal. This is not just some, this is some way. That's what I mean about the whole concept of the myth poetic, meaning there was a time in the world where people understood holy places, holy waters. You know, even the pagans understood this tree's different. The world was a different place when it was lit by fire. And a lot of that has been erased from our memory, so to speak, during all the different kinds of Reformation, the cultural revolutions, materialism, all that. But within the Orthodox Church, you still have a belief in the burning bush, so to speak, which an icon is. So I hope this kind of gives you a little bit of info.
Okay.
Is this all good?
Yeah. Whatever.
This is good. I mean, this is what I'm just saying.
This is good. This is good.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I just didn't want you to leave with nothing.
Okay.
And the reason I don't say much about much of this because now I am afraid of words. Didn't our Lord say that you will be judged by every word you spoke? And so if I'm speaking a bunch of words here that goes out into, I'm going to have to make sure that, wait a second, remember when you said this on YouTube, Daniel? Oh, yeah. Well, I think everything I said to you has been honest and sincere so far. And this is why I'd rather be, no one see my face. What difference does it make? Really? It's just great you're here. Thank you for coming.
Sure.
And I'm sorry, just aside, my work is just so demanding. I mean, I see the worst of the worst. People with, the worst of the worst. During 40, it's like a 36-hour tour, so to speak, 3 days. But that's what I've always worked with crises. And so that's it, brother. Thank you for coming. We can go back to the.
All right.
They won't miss us. They think of us as heretics.